When we enter the later part of the early dynastic period, we start finding his name on a tablet with a list of the gods from the 24th to 26th century BC. So, as I said earlier, we see him being talked about as actually an individual that was a king, but we start seeing him in the early dynastic period as on a list of gods. There's been heroic figures on the tablet from the 3rd millennium all the way to the 7th millennium BC that looks like Gilgamesh and Enkidu, some of which the hero is in lion skin. It was not written down, so it could have been passed down verbally for thousands of years. And now moving forward again in time, the Akkadians and the Sumerian connection. More evidence of Gilgamesh was found around the 24th century BC, right? 2400 BC, in inscriptions dedicated to Gilgamesh. There was a pot with his inscription photo, same century that Mesopotamia became an empire. And I think I have the image of the pot here. Let me show you. Yep, here it is. I didn't get a chance to finish the image. Here's the one that we find about him, and it says, "To the Gilgamesh, the king of men, Grima, the son of the shepherd Lunkangani, has dedicated this artfully made mace. It is of alabaster. To him, the strong one, the son of goddess Ninsam, for his own life and for the lives of his wife and their children." And that one dates back quite some time, which connects to the Gilgamesh story. Where am I here? So the 24th century, where we see the evidence of Gilgamesh, is actually the same century that Mesopotamia actually became a full-fledged empire. There was also a city in Mesopotamia called Akkad, and the Acadian Empire spoke about a Semitic language, but worshipped some of the same gods as the Sumerians. And it's not fully known exactly where the Akkadians originated from. They invaded the south of Mesopotamia, and they incorporated the Sumerian city-states. The empire was passed down to its successors for 200 years. First successful documented succession in that area, 200 years of succession. Naram Sin King brought the Acadian Empire to its greatest extent. After his death, though, it quickly collapsed in the 22nd century BC, and invaders ruled the area until the century when Sumerian kings succeeded it, creating a second unified state of Mesopotamia. So we have the Sumerians, we have the Akkadians coming in, and then after 200 years, we have the Sumerians coming back again. This is when the ziggurat building program took off. The Sumerian ziggurat building program, when the second Mesopotamian empire, basically. Shulgi took control of the new empire and created a diplomatic contacts with the surrounding areas. A uniform writing system was created at this time, and the Sumerian literature as well as historical records were created. This is where we see more evidence of Gilgamesh, because there was an actual program, if you will, to start documenting history and bringing it more cohesive together. Sumerian's king list was also created here. Later versions showed a descent from Sumer from the heavens and spoke about a great flood and kings before the flood and after. So let me say that again. Later versions of these tablets showed a descent of Sumer from the heavens and spoke about a great flood and the kings that existed before and after. And within these kings lists, there was around 8 kings that spanned around 241,000 years of rule. And here's some ziggurats, an actual image of it, and then a little artist interpretation. And here is all 4 sides of the Sumerian's kings list. So what about the legitimacy of the kings lists? It may have not been historical, but have been propaganda. These are some theories. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm giving you all the evidence here. Some believe that it may have actually been a propaganda tool to show how long they lived and an unbroken rule of Sumer, even though archaeological evidence shows that there were other ancient civilizations before them. Because what this shows is Sumer actually existed for much longer, and that these kings were Sumerian kings, but we know that there were different empires that existed in that time. So that's why I asked this next part here. What are your own thoughts on this? is this evidence of ancient lists of people with long lifespans that maybe weren't even Sumerians, but were from other ancient civilizations, but they just included it in the Sumerians kings list? Is it propaganda? Is it a big mix of both? Is it pre-flood kings and post-flood kings that really wasn't just Sumer, but they just called it the Sumerians kings list, or we're just calling it the Sumerians kings list? Well, one piece of information I'll give you here, not to go off too much of a tangent, if you look at the lifespans, the ruling spans of these kings, they actually tie with the Yuga cycle ages of ancient India. Not the Yuga cycles in the 26,000 year cycle, but the bigger one of the hundreds of thousand year cycle. Each of them actually has all of the basically cycle ages are represented by different kings, right? Within specific ones, right? Not, some of them have really short rules. And then also the geometry of ancient Egypt, which is something I'm going to show at the Ancient Egypt and Extraterrestrial Connection Conference. The geometry of certain areas, like multiplied by the distance between different structures, actually creates the same numbers of the years of rule of the Egyptian, of the kings that had the longest rules on the kings list, which connects to also the Yuga cycles of India. And we're going to get into that in our 2-day conference on ancient India and the Indus Valley civilization, where I'm going to do a presentation connecting Sumer, Indus civilization, and Egypt together. So some Sumer kings were known to have existed, but they don't show up here. So we also know that some kings actually existed, but they're not even on the list. And it was periodically revised based on city, state, and dynasty. So the whole concept of history is written by the victors, that didn't just start a few hundred years ago. It went back to this time as well. So it was periodically revised based on who needed to have control or who had control at that time. There were two early rulers on this king's list as well that were contemporaries of Gilgamesh that supposedly lived around the same time as Gilgamesh. One, his name is Enmbaragesi, the oldest king which we know existed through archaeological evidence. So we've actually found evidence of his existence. And then Akka or Aga, who is the son of Enmbaragesi. Gilgamesh was first mentioned as a god before a king, a hybridized giant, basically. He was known as the king of men. In later Babylonian texts, much of his exploits and descriptions of his quest were completely removed. Gilgamesh, it was just like a basic story of him rather than him going to the cedar forest, him having this fight with Enkidu. In some of the texts, Enkidu isn't even mentioned or is mentioned as a slave rather than his counterpart. So many different stories were there. Gilgamesh was almost like how many gospels there were before Constantine in 325 AD decided to take a bunch out and rewrite a bunch of them, right? Kind of the same concept here. Gilgamesh was also mentioned in a later king's list credited for rebuilding ancient temples. And it's important to note that these dates are pretty far away from each other in the times that he was mentioned. We have uncovered many of these ancient temples that he was credited for. In about 2024 BC, the third dynasty of Ur, we see his exploits with Enkidu covered in detail. So after some time of not even speaking about his exploits with Enkidu, we start seeing it coming back, and his stories about where he went and what he did with Enkidu become front and center. A lot of parts, here's a little disclaimer for you guys at the bottom here. A lot of parts of these tablets are missing, making people speculate or debate over the true meaning of these tablets. It needs to be said. We're just trying to piece together history when a lot of it is actually like not even completely discovered or is missing. In the Neo-Sumerian version of Gilgamesh, which is around 2112 BC to 2004 BC, we have five poems in Sumerian. We have two separate versions of these poems. There's one that's Gilgamesh and the Netherworld. And in this tablet, which is tablet 12, I believe, we speak about how the gods divided the universe between them, and great storm blows down a willow tree. And I put a little note here, one out of the many, okay? How the gods divided the universe between them. And, you know, just to throw this out there, because obviously it requires a lot more explanation, but I feel that you guys will get it, that when you talk about monotheistic religions, there's evidence to suggest that it wasn't a monotheistic religion to begin with, that it was almost like one God saying, you must follow me, this is the way, and ignore the other gods, right? Like choosing one out of the many. When it comes to Judaism, right, the Old Testament, which is the premise for a lot that came within Islam and Christianity, there's definitely a suggestion of one between a selection of one out of the multiple gods. Inanna here takes the tree to Uruk that got knocked down, the willow tree, and plants it in the Yana district. But due to this, the city gets infested and she turns to Gilgamesh for help. He gets rid of the inhabitants and carves a tree into wood for Inanna. Gilgamesh sends his servants to the netherworld, and when they're there, they get detained because he does not show the proper respect. And Enkidu in the same poem gets raised from the netherworld, because Enkidu, if you remember earlier, is basically put to death. So now we see a poem later, a couple thousand years later, talking about Enkidu actually being resurrected from the dead and brought back to life because Gilgamesh sent someone down to the netherworld. There's a second tale as well. The second tale is called The Death of Gilgamesh. And in here, he's seized by Namatar, the emissary of death. Enki shows vision of God judging his exploits in the cedar forest. God judging Gilgamesh and what he did in the cedar forest. He learned the wisdom from Ziusudra, the only survivor of the deluge. Upnapishtim, same person. In a dream, the gods say to Gilgamesh, after he descends to the underworld, he'll be given a special place as judge of the dead. Right now, we're seeing that story again. So you can see there's a little more detail coming here in the Neo-Sumerian scriptures. He awakens and seeks counsel and is told to be sad at his fate, that he's going to have to go to the underworld and be the judge of the dead. But then the poem talks about the building of his tomb and that Gilgamesh and his wives were all sealed in his tomb when Gilgamesh died. And then the river, right? And I'm sure there's probably information out there, but one of the two rivers in that area was then released and went over his tomb in order to cover it and return to its normal flow. The dead carried out, so the dead in the underworld were known to carry out a shadowy existence in the netherworld, except for Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was given a special place there. So you heard me mention Ziusudra and Upnapishtim. Now, this is the smoking gun that was for me when I started getting into all this awareness, which is the Noah story. And when I first started getting into it, I'm like, wait, is Gilgamesh Noah? But then I started doing more research and I realized that he actually met Noah, or the survivor of the Great Flood. So Ziusudra is what Upnapishtim was known as in Sumer. And Upnapishtim was the Acadian Empire version, right? The name of him then. Ziusudra of Shuruppak is listed in WP62 Sumerian Kings list. He's a recession. He was the last king of Sumer prior to the Great Flood. He is subsequently recorded as the hero of the Sumerian creation myth and appears in writing of Berosus. We hear that the story of Gilgamesh being a giant, having superhuman powers. And this connects to the flood story of pre-flood and the Nephilim and the giants existing in those days, right? And we see that in the Old Testament. We see a lot of evidence of giants. Then Hugh Newman, it does a lot of information and awareness on the giants. He did a presentation on Port Ascension a couple of years ago where he spoke about it. It's incredible. And but we hear about him being a giant, and this is where we get to the hybridization question of if Gilgamesh was a hybrid being of maybe the Anunnaki or some great civilization that existed but wasn't entirely Homo sapien and had these superhuman powers because of his connection or because of his hybridization. The Nephilim are mentioned just before the flood story in the account of Genesis in Genesis 6:4, which states the following: the Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans who bore children to them. These were the heroes were of old, warriors of renown. And then also we have it in the Greek text, According to Hesiod, the giants were the offspring of Gaia, which is the earth, born from the blood that fell when Uranus, sky god, the sky, was castrated by his Titan son Cronus. Archaic and classical representations show Gigantes as a man-sized hoplites, heavily armed ancient Greek foot soldiers, human form. So we have the stories of giants throughout. So the question is this also a story of giants? And as I think Sarian showed, and William as well, where we see these tablets that show that these beings that were in contact or communication with humans, or maybe had some sort of hybridization program, seem to be, in these tablets at least, much larger than the humans were. And this connects to the sons of God, which was one of the first things that I learned about alongside the Epic of Gilgamesh. That the sons of God, who are they? Are they the fallen angels? The fallen angels were the second tier of the gods that lived alongside the Anunnaki. And it's important to say here that there are multiple theories in regards to these beings, right? The Aiji, whether they were a slave race to the Anunnaki, whether they worked alongside them, whether they had just less powers than them, but had the same kind of agenda for humanity, whether they were the giants or they were the fallen angels that mated with the daughters of men, therefore creating the giant offspring. So could Gilgamesh be the offspring of the fallen angels with the daughters of men? When he met Ziusudra, the Noah story here, the immortal, he spoke about the flood in which the Nephilim were on earth before and after. The demigod qualities and superhuman strength of Gilgamesh kind of also shows when it comes to the sons of God and the Aiji, maybe there were demigods, right? We have the gods, which are the Anunnaki. Then we have the Aiji, which were also some sort of advanced beings, and they had superhuman qualities, but they're more like demigods. And this also connects to the fact that the story of Gilgamesh has a lot of parallels to stories of demigods throughout all ancient scriptures, including the story of Hercules, who was what? A demigod, right? When the gods and the humans mate together, we create a demigod. Daughters of men, sons of God, demigod. Many references of God-human hybrids in ancient texts, as I just said. We have Greece, definitely talks about it, Titans, Mesopotamia, the Old Testament, Hindu texts, and beyond. Even in the book of Enoch, right, we have the book of Enoch lists the leaders of the 200 fallen angels. These are the fallen angels who allegedly commenced an unnatural union with human women. In so doing, their actions resulted in a hybrid offspring, and they allegedly taught humans the forbidden knowledge. Some are also listed in the book of Raziel, the Zohar, and the book of Jubilees. Well, let's take a moment here to speak about the Aiji. The story of Atrahasis, the Babylonian story of the flood, and the precursor to the flood story of Gilgamesh, right? Because the story of Gilgamesh was just fragmented text until later, where they all came together and sorted it out, made it more into an epic. The story of him existed, but the precursor to this was the story of Atrahasis. This offers some evidence of the relationship between the Anunnaki and some call them the Ijiji. The poem begins with the lines, "When the gods, like men, bore the work and suffered the toil of the gods was great. The work was heavy. The distress was much." The composition continues. The 7 great Anunnaki were making the Ijiji suffer the work. What follows is a partly fragmentary, but seems to indicate that the Ijiji gods did not want to work anymore, and therefore the Anunnaki had to find a solution. What was the solution? Ultimately, this led to the creation of humans, who from then on had to bear the gods' work. In this story, it appears that the Ijiji were subordinate to the Anunnaki. It is unclear which deities were included in the Ijiji group. Were they subordinate? Were they like servants? Were they equals, as I just said in the last slide? Were they just from the same planet, same portal, same Nibiru, but there's 2 races of beings and they had different kind of qualities to them? In Genesis 1:26 to 27, we see, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on earth. And the Sumerian version, we have Ninma will bind upon it in the image of the gods. It is man. Ninma said will bind upon it the image of the gods. It is man. So here we have two opposing views of creationism and evolution, right? Could it be both? Right? We have creationism, right, which says that we were created by God, well, however long fundamental religious scholars date back, I think it's like 6,000 years or something. And then we have evolution, which is the evolution of humanity to get to this point. I feel that the answer is somewhere in between. We were evolving species, and the Sumerian scriptures kind of backs this. We're evolving species, and then some sort of hybridization occurred, creating something that maybe moved us to more of a sentient experience, and the Homo sapiens, as we now know it, created maybe from Homo erectus to Homo sapien. So by the politicization and the religiousification, which I don't even know if it's a word, I just wrote it down, of these beliefs, we are unable to see the middle ground. That it's kind of a combination of both, where instead we have these two opposing views. You either believe in evolution or you believe in creationism. And here is the story from the Sumerian scriptures, from the Mesopotamian scriptures, that kind of is the source material for the hybridization of humanity. So Enki thinks of the germinating powers of the clay and the waters of the abyss, and he tells Namu to have some womb goddesses pinch of this clay and thicken it so she can mold it or give birth to the humans. Mix the heart of the clay that is over the abyss. The good and princely fashioners will thicken the clay. You, Namu, do you bring the limbs into existence? Ninma, Earth Mother, will work above you. The goddesses of birth will stand by you at your fashioning. O my mother, decree it's the newborn's fate. Ninma will bind upon it the image of the gods. It is man. Without the sperm of a male, she gave birth to offspring, to the embryo of mankind. I think I said that slow enough for you to catch the parts that I was trying to emphasize there, right? So we see in multiple ancient scriptures, actually, when talking about clay, it's almost like a molding of humanity, right? And you see, bring the limbs into existence. Ninma will work above you, right? The goddesses of birth, goddesses, O mother, decree it the newborn's fate. Bind upon it the image of the God, made in their image and their likeness. It is us, guys, man. But what? Without sperm. She gave to offspring the embryo of mankind. Miraculous conception here, or some sort of hybridization program. Now back to Mesopotamia. And we're on the final stretch here. So let's talk about ancient Babylon, right? So now we're going to the 17th century BC, where Babylon grew into a large city-state. Huge kingdoms and continual warfare was happening throughout Mesopotamia at this time. In 1766 BC, city-states came together and conquered other city-states. We see a written language and literature continue to evolve also. Up until the third dynasty of Ur, Sumerian was the dominant language. Akkadian became the #1 language to the Middle East and the Mediterranean soon after that. Now, this is where we see a unified epic of Gilgamesh. During the third dynasty of Ur, soon after that, we start seeing a combination of these stories, and the entire story of prehistory, pre-flood, and Gilgamesh starts getting put together by the fragments into what we currently know as the story of Gilgamesh. And here is the final slide, what we need to discuss. Why is all of this even important in the first place? Well, the story of Gilgamesh inspired many stories of ancient religions and cultures that came later, including Hercules and heroes of the Odyssey and Noah, right? And why is that important? Well, once we start seeing that we come from, we are sharing stories that people are literally religiously holding on to, fundamentally even, that these stories go back even further, we can draw connections to many different religions, many different cultures, and find similarities and look at what these literal things that occurred happen, the historical truths behind all of this, right? Because the story of Noah is considered by myth, by many people that aren't Christian, considered to be real, but have no actual archaeological awareness of it by people who are fundamentally religious, right? Because there was a flood, there was a cataclysm. Was there one individual there, or was this a mythological story about an individual during that time, right? As we start piecing together our history, we can start actually spending time on figuring out these truths. But because we're so fragmented and we believe our way is the only way, well, not all of us, obviously, but many religions believe that, it doesn't give us the opportunity to have these balanced, rational discussions to really figure out and piece together our history. But the evidence is hidden in plain sight. His exploits led him to the cedar forest in modern Lebanon, Babylonia, and to the Persian Gulf, Gilgamesh, right? And lots of different connections and a lot of historical evidence of what happened during those times. It was a story of companionship, story of love, human struggle against mortality. These are the key themes, right? The themes of humanity as we were discovering what it meant to be human and interact with each other, and relationships between different city-states that continue to evolve to modern day, and our relationships between countries and so forth. This possibly, why is this important? Well, this possibly connects to extraterrestrials and influence on humanity. Just as I showed earlier, giants, sons of God, Anunnaki, Aiji, hybridization. There's a lot of truths that, again, if we had rational, balanced conversations and sat down with each other rather than our blind faiths, we could start actually maybe piecing together some of this awareness. By the time, and plus, there's probably a lot of archaeological discoveries that have been completely swept under the rug, either based on religion, not wanting it to come out, elitism, right, where the elite don't want it to come out, or just by people not wanting to be ridiculed and losing their jobs or their grants as archaeologists and researchers, so they don't want to go against the grain, except they just accept the conventional awareness. But if it was okay to come up with conflicting views of the true timeline of history and what occurred, and it was made safe for people to do that, you could start having these conversations and really piece it together. So the answers are very simple, but the system has been created in a way that does not benefit us being truthful to our history. By the time the most famous version of his story, Gilgamesh, was composed in the late second millennium BC, his exploits are already known for thousands of years. So that goes back long before Babylon and the Sumerian kings list. That might even go back to prehistory. Well, if it's the flood story, that might go back to 13,000 years ago, or the flood that occurred a little after that even, and the connection to Atlantis, and maybe an asteroid hitting our planet, in which through archaeological evidence, we now know that there was a cataclysm that occurred around 13,000 years ago. Another conversation we could have by having rational, balanced, just like exploration of this information. So objects were also dedicated to Gilgamesh. Again, why is this important? Well, even though we see the fragments of his story come together in the second millennium BC, objects were dedicated to him at the beginning of prehistory, 7,000 BC, and maybe even before that, which further suggests this was an ancient story of a great flood. And look at all ancient cultures. They almost all have a story of a great flood. Another similarity that connects us all, possibly 13,000 years ago, 11,900 BC, which is what some people say was the time of the fall of Atlantis, was the time of the cataclysm, right? Some people give different datings there, but I'm just throwing that out. So these are all, this story of Gilgamesh is a story of humanity. It's a metaphoric, it might have some myth in it. It has also the struggles of us discovering ourselves as we were creating city-states and interacting with humanity, but it also connects to the fall of civilization and the rise of civilization, and possibly even the evolution, the devolution of consciousness. So these are the reasons why that this story is important. And that's it for me from this presentation. Love and appreciate you all.